For most of human history, there were no kings, no rulers, and definitely no thrones. Our ancestors lived in small scattered groups, focused simply on surviving day by day. Life was about the hunt, the gathering, the immediate needs of the family. So, how did we get from that to a world filled with governments, presidents, and systems of power? Somewhere on our long journey, a monumental shift occurred. We didn't just start building cities, we started building authority. We invented control. This transformation is one of the most incredible stories of our species. How did ordinary humans, living as equals, learn to rule over one another? And maybe more importantly, why did other people agree to be ruled? This wasn't a single event, but a slow, evolving process. It began with the need for order. Imagine a growing village facing a crisis, like a drought or a conflict with a neighboring group. Someone needed to make decisions, organize a response, and lead the way. These first leaders weren't kings. They were likely the best hunters, the wisest elders, or the most charismatic storytellers. Their authority was earned, not inherited, and it was often temporary. They led because they were trusted and respected. But as societies grew more complex, so did the need for leadership. Organizing large-scale farming, building irrigation canals, or defending a city required a more permanent form of authority. This is where we see the first real governments take shape in ancient cities, like those in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Leadership became a formal role, a job. Rules were written down, créés en laouche. Bureaucracies emerged to manage resources and collect taxes. And then came the ultimate evolution of power, the rise of kings and pharaohs. These rulers didn't just claim authority based on skill, they claimed it was given to them by the gods. This idea of divine right was a powerful tool. It made their rules seem not just that it was pure influence, built on trust and respect, not commands. In these small bands, humanity took its first crucial step. Learning to follow, this simple act of trusting another person's judgment would lay the foundation for everything to come. As these small groups grew, something fundamental changed. A band of 20 people is one thing, but a village of 100 is another. Communication became more complex, and so did the problems. Suddenly, it wasn't just about the next hunt. It was about keeping peace between neighbors, organizing shared resources, and making plans for the future. People began relying on individuals who were good at these things. The mediators, the planners, the problem solvers. These weren't rulers. They were proto-leaders, holding the group together not with force, but with social skill and reliability. These were the first sparks of organized society, born out of the need for cooperation. Then, humanity took another giant leap. Camps turned into villages, and villages grew into permanent settlements. With this stability came a new challenge. Structure. Leadership was no longer just about surviving an immediate crisis. It was about managing a community. This meant organizing labor for building projects, overseeing food storage for the winter, and defending territory from rival groups. The scale was bigger, and the stakes were higher. This is the moment where leadership began its slow transformation into authority. Roles that were once temporary started to become more fixed. A person wasn't just a leader during an emergency. They were the person everyone looked to for decisions, day in and day out. And here's where the psychology shifted. People grew accustomed to being guided. Having someone in charge made life more predictable and secure. This reliability created a powerful feedback loop. The more a leader successfully guided the community, the more the community trusted them. This trust solidified their position, and leadership began to be seen not just as a temporary role, but as a permanent identity. Certain individuals, or even entire families, started to be recognized as the ones who lead. This was a profound change. For the first time, human society began to instead of everyone being on equal footing, clear differences in influence emerged. The respect given to a skilled hunter morphed into the expectation placed upon a village head, and that expectation slowly hardened into real authority. This opened the door to hierarchy, a concept our ancestors had never known. The idea that some people were meant to lead, and others were meant to follow, started to take root in the collective human mind. Leadership, once flexible and shared, was beginning to concentrate. The final piece of the puzzle was control over resources. As settlements grew, the person who managed the grain storage wasn't just an administrator. They held power over who ate. The one who mediated disputes wasn't just a peacemaker. They could now enforce rules and punishments. The power to guide was evolving into the power to command. But this didn't happen because someone staged a violent takeover. It happened because it worked. People willingly gave this power to leaders because a well-managed community was a safer, more prosperous community. And once a society experiences the benefits of order, it rarely chooses to go back to chaos. This is the critical transition point in our history. The moment when influence, combined with responsibility, created a new formula, power. We're still a long way from crowns and constitutions, but the seeds were all planted here. In these early settlements, humans learned what leadership feels like, what it means to follow, and how a single person's influence could shape the destiny of an entire group. From here, the path to rulership, empires, and the world we know today was set. The journey of leadership had just begun. The next topic is the birth of authority. Have you ever wondered why we have bosses, kings, or presidents? Where did this idea of one person having power over others even come from? For most of human history, we lived in small, tight-knit groups where leadership was temporary. A great hunter might lead the hunt. A wise elder might settle a dispute, but their influence ended when the task was done. It was all about respect, not rules. But then, everything changed. As our ancestors settled down and villages grew into the world's first towns, life got complicated. Suddenly, you had dozens of families living side by side, sharing land, water, and resources. And with more people came more problems. Who gets the last of the stored grain? Where does my farm end and yours begin? The old way of temporary leaders just wasn't cutting it anymore. They needed something new, something stronger. They needed someone who could not just suggest solutions, but enforce them. This is the moment authority was born. Now, leadership and authority sound similar, but they're worlds apart. Leadership is influence. You follow someone because you trust their skill or judgment. But authority? That's power. It's the recognized right to make rules and expect everyone to follow them. For these early societies, this was a massive shift. With crowded communities came the need for organization, and with the organization came the need for control. The first clues archaeologists found for this shift are in how resources were managed. Think about it. Someone had to be in charge of the communal ground. They had to track how much food was stored, plan the next harvest, and decide how to distribute it. This role, seemingly just a practical job, held enormous power. Why? Because the person who controls the food controls who eats. They control survival itself. Once a community started depending on this central figure for their daily bread, it was a small step to accept their decisions in other areas of life. This food distributor quickly became the go-to person for settling arguments. If two families were fighting over a plot of land or a stolen goat, someone had to have the final say. The moment people agreed to accept one person's judgment as the final word, that's when authority became real. It was no longer just temporary influence. It was recognized, binding power. But something else was happening in the background. Something subtle. This sense of responsibility, of being the community's problem solver, began to transform into a sense of entitlement. The person making all the decisions started seeing their role not just as a duty, but as a permanent position, a job for life. And what happens when a role becomes permanent? It often becomes inheritable. The idea that my father was the leader, so now I am the leader, started to take root. Authority was shifting from a service performed for the group to a personal identity. At the same time, societies were getting more ambitious. They started massive projects like building irrigation canals, defensive walls, and large temples. You can't build a canal with 100 people all doing their own thing. You need a coordinator, a project manager with the power to assign tasks and direct the labor. This organizational control became seen as a natural part of life. People began to accept the idea that some individuals were simply born to lead, and others were born to follow. Now, it's important to understand this wasn't necessarily seen as oppression at the time. It was an adaptation. These systems of control, this new structure of authority, kept communities from falling apart. It allowed them to grow, to prosper, and to survive in a more complex world. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. But then came the true turning point, the moment that would shape human history forever. Leaders began to connect their power to something much bigger than just being a good organizer. They started associating themselves with the divine. The message became, I lead not just because I am capable, but because the gods chose me. This single idea transformed authority into sacred authority. Suddenly, questioning the leader was the same as questioning the will of the gods. Something completely unthinkable in these deeply religious early cultures. Authority was no longer just a social agreement. It hardened into a sacred, unquestionable truth. Once this belief took hold, leaders no longer had to earn their respect day in and day out. Their power was automatically justified by divine will. They weren't just managers anymore. They were chosen. They were special, set apart from everyone else. This is the real birth of rulership as we know it. Authority now expanded beyond just practical decisions. Leaders became the keepers of rituals, the community's spiritual representatives, the very embodiment of their culture's identity. They became more than just they became the center of the community's entire worldview. People followed them not only because it was necessary for survival, but because it felt right, it felt meaningful. And once authority gains that kind of deep, symbolic meaning, it becomes incredibly difficult to challenge. This was the moment humanity crossed a profound threshold. We went from having leaders we choose based on merit to having rulers we believe in based on faith and destiny. From that single, powerful shift, the entire story of kingdoms, empires, governments, and society as we know it begins to unfold. It all started with a simple need to organize a growing village. When authority first became accepted, a deeper transformation began to unfold, one far more powerful than any single leader or decision. Power stopped being something individuals simply held and became something societies believed in. Leadership turned into rulership, and rulership evolved into a cultural truth. This change didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over generations, shaping the very fabric of early civilization. In the beginning, leaders ruled because they were needed. They organized hunts, settled disputes, and kept the community safe. But soon, people began building stories around them, stories that justified their position, explained their origin, and gave meaning to their authority. These stories became myths, rituals, and traditions. As communities grew and their histories stretched across centuries, these traditions gained immense weight. They became part of a collective identity. This was the birth of cultural power. A ruler was no longer just a person managing resources. They became a symbol. They were a living representation of the community's survival, its unity, and even its connection to the divine. And once people tied leadership to their own identity, culture itself started reinforcing the hierarchy. Power became normal. You were born into a world where some people stood above others. Some lead, others followed. Some made decisions, others obeyed. These weren't seen as inequalities. They were seen as a natural order of life. Children grew up watching rituals performed by leaders, hearing stories of their ancestors' authority, and absorbing social roles that felt eternal. People didn't simply accept power. They grew up inside it. Daily life began reflecting this structure. Homes were built with signs of hierarchy, larger houses for elite families, special tools or ornaments reserved for leaders, and distinct clothing or symbols that marked who held authority. Ceremonies reinforced this separation, with leaders sitting or standing on raised platforms, surrounded by guards, priests, or advisors. The environment around people constantly reminded them, power belongs to certain individuals. Obedience belongs to the rest. This wasn't forced, it was cultural, but the strongest force in this transformation was religion. The moment leaders were tied to a divine purpose, their authority gained a supernatural shield. Whether rulers were seen as chosen by gods, blessed by spirits, or descended from sacred ancestors, their authority was now rooted in belief, something far more enduring than fear. People didn't follow rulers just because they had the power to punish them. They followed them because they believed those rulers should have power. This shift had massive consequences. When the ruler became sacred, the entire system around them became sacred. Laws, traditions, property rights, and social classes were no longer just practical arrangements. They became part of a divine design. Challenging authority no longer meant disagreeing with a person, it meant challenging the order of the universe itself. Rebellion became almost unthinkable, and so power stabilized. Early leaders didn't just command, they shaped culture. They funded temples, maintained rituals, owned ceremonial items, and oversaw the festivals that tied community life together. The ruler was everywhere, in stories, in art, in religion, in politics, and in the very identity of the people. As this integration continued, something else emerged. Succession. Once a leader was seen as sacred, their bloodline gained a powerful symbolic meaning. The children of rulers were seen as inheriting that divine blessing. Leadership became hereditary, turning powerful families into dynasties and transforming power from a temporary role into a permanent institution. Authority no longer relied on a leader's skill, it relied on their lineage. This was the final stage in the cultural evolution of power, when leadership became locked into generational continuity. But culture did more than just preserve power. It expanded Italiano. As societies grew, rulers began controlling more than just decisions, they controlled meaning. They shaped calendars, determined religious rituals, influenced moral codes, and served as the essential connection between the earthly and the divine worlds. Power was no longer just a position. It was the axis around which the entire society rotated. And through this long process, humans learned something truly transformative. Power doesn't survive through force. It survives through belief. When a community believes in the authority of its rulers, the system becomes self-sustaining. No army is needed, no threats are required. Culture carries power forward naturally, like a river flowing downhill. By this stage in human development, rulers no longer needed to prove their worth. The culture all around them proved it for them. People lived inside the story of rulership, and that story shaped their identity as much as their environment or their ancestry. This evolution of power into culture laid the foundation for everything that came next. The rise of formal laws, the formation of states, the birth of the first kingdoms and empires, the creation of social classes, the invention of complex political systems. Everything we recognize as civilization grew from this cultural acceptance of power. And now, with power woven deeply into the identity of civilizations, humanity stood on the edge of a new and dramatic transformational moment, when culture, authority, and organization fused into something far more powerful, something that would define the next several thousand years of our history: government. When societies grew from small tribes to bustling cities, a new problem emerged. How do you keep thousands of people living together peacefully? Brute force and a single leader's command weren't enough anymore. Rulers needed something stronger, something that could organize daily life even when they weren't physically present. That something would become one of the greatest inventions in human history: law. Laws were humanity's first real attempt to turn abstract ideas like fairness and order into a permanent system. Think about it. Before this, justice was entirely dependent on the mood of the leader. Two similar disputes might get two completely different rulings. One chief might punish harshly, another might forgive easily. This unpredictability created chaos. People craved consistency, rules that applied to everyone, not just rules that lived inside a ruler's head. This shift wasn't just about creating order, it was about creating stability. The very first laws weren't written down on scrolls or tablets. They were spoken, memorized, and passed down through generations by elders and councils. These early legal traditions focused on the essentials of community life: ownership, marriage, responsibility, and safety. If someone injured another person, they owed them compensation. If someone stole grain from the community storage, they were punished. These were social contracts, long before the word contract even existed. But something much deeper was happening. Laws didn't just control behavior. They fundamentally redefined the relationship between the ruler and the people. Instead of relying on a leader's personal and often emotional judgment, people started to rely on a shared, impersonal system. Law became the invisible scaffolding holding society together. And once this system was in place, rulers gained a new, incredible kind of power. They could not just command armies or collect taxes, but they could now define what was right and wrong for everyone. This gave rulers authority over morality itself. The greatest leap forward, however, came when humans started writing these laws down. The world's first recorded legal codes appear in ancient Mesopotamia, in civilizations like Sumer and Babylon. These were already complex societies, with kings, priests, temples, and sprawling cities. Their world was crowded, filled with economic exchanges that desperately needed regulation. So, rulers began carving their rules into clay tablets and massive stone pillars, making them unchangeable, permanent, and most importantly, public. These written laws changed everything. For the first time, the rules couldn't be secretly altered to benefit a friend or punish an enemy. Decisions couldn't be hidden away in a ruler's private chambers. Justice finally had a reference point. A stone pillar standing in the middle of the marketplace sent a powerful message to every citizen, from the richest merchant to the poorest farmer. These are the rules that guide us all. This simple act created two revolutionary ideas that we still live by today. First, the law is above any single individual. Even the king presented the law as something sacred, often claiming it came from the gods, not from his own personal desires. This put a check on absolute power. Second, society became predictable. People finally understood what would happen if they broke a rule. They no longer had to live in constant fear of a leader's random punishments or unpredictable whims. This predictability built something essential for any large-scale society: trust. As these societies grew even more complex, so did their laws. Soon, there were hundreds of regulations covering every aspect of life: agricultural duties, trade rules, temple protections, marriage rights, property boundaries, inheritance principles, and more. Every part of daily existence became structured. Every action had a known consequence. The invention of law also introduced the powerful idea of justista, belief that society should treat people fairly, based on principles, not on power or emotion. This concept of justice was the glue that tied communities together. It offered protection to the weak and placed limits on the powerful. It also gave rulers legitimacy. A king who enforced just laws wasn't seen as a tyrant, but as a guardian of order and stability. But let's be realistic. It wasn't a perfect system. Law also became a tool for enforcing social hierarchy. Written laws often protected the elites far more than the common people. Fines for the same crime were often different depending on your social status. Certain duties were required only from the lower classes. So while law brought fairness in theory, it often cemented inequality in practice. Still, even these imperfect laws were a massive improvement over pure chaos. People were willing to accept a certain level of inequality in exchange for stability, safety, and a society that actually functioned. With laws in place, rulers had a much stronger foundation for their control. Instead of ruling purely through force, they could govern through structure, instead of simply demanding obedience. They could justify their rule through the promise of order. The law became the ruler's shield, but it also became their responsibility. If a ruler openly broke their own laws, they risked losing divine favor and, more practically, public trust. So, in a way, law wasn't just a tool of control, it was also a tool of accountability, even for the most powerful. Through this shared system of rules, people began to feel a new kind of connection. Whether they were rich or poor, a farmer or a merchant, they all lived under the same legal framework. They recognized the same rules, the same punishments, and the same expectations. In the same way that culture creates a sense of belonging, law created a sense of unity. By inventing law, humanity learned a profound lesson. For power to last, it must be structured. For authority to be respected, it must be predictable. And for order to be trusted, it must be shared. Laws became the very backbone of civilization, and they prepared the world for the next great transformation in human history. The rise of something far more organized, ambitious, and powerful than anything that had come before. The world's first states. The next topic is the rise of states, with laws shaping daily life and stabilizing growing populations. Human societies were ready for their next big leap. The creation of states. A state was more than a settlement, more than a cluster of villages, or even a powerful ruler standing above everyone else. A state was an organized machine. It brought together leadership, law, resources, labor, religion, and identity into one unified structure. For the first time, humans created societies that were bigger than any single individual. The earliest states began to form in the great river civilizations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and ancient China. These places already had fertile land, large populations, bustling trade networks, and some form of centralized authority. But what truly transformed them into states was organization, the ability to coordinate thousands of people toward shared goals. To become a state, a society needed specialists. It needed farmers to grow food, builders to construct canals and temples, scribes to record taxes and laws, priests to maintain rituals, soldiers to protect borders, and leaders to plan and command. Once all these roles were connected under a central authority, a new kind of society emerged, one capable of long-term planning and truly massive projects. This is where humanity first tasted monumental ambition. Early states built irrigation canals that stretched 4 kilometers. They constructed temples and monuments that reached for the sky. They dug reservoirs, managed river flows, and meticulously planned agricultural seasons. None of this was possible in a simple village. It required coordination, management, and systems that allowed people to work together even if they didn't personally know each other. The state turned strangers into citizens. It created a shared identity, stronger than family, tribe, or clan. Suddenly, people belonged not just to a small group, they belonged to a kingdom. They served a ruler whose authority was supported not only by belief, but by administration. And this brought something entirely new into the world: bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracy might sound dull today, but it fundamentally changed human history. It meant that important tasks didn't depend solely on a king's memory or mood. Instead, scribes recorded harvests, taxes, births, deaths, property claims, and trade deals. These written records allowed states to plan years ahead. Not whose days. A king could die, but the system survived. A drought could strike, but stored grain and calculated reserves could save the people. This stability gave states real, lasting power. But states didn't just manage resources, they expanded them. With organized labor, they dramatically increased agricultural output, supported much larger populations, and built military forces capable of defending territory or expanding it. Borders became real, armies became permanent, and leaders became kings. This was the moment humans learned something profound. Power grows when structure grows. A village leader could influence a few dozen people. A chieftain could command a few hundred, but a king supported by laws, soldiers, priests, and scribes could rule tens of thousands. The state multiplied a ruler's authority, turning personal power into systemic power that outlived the individual, and the people benefited too. In many ways, states offered protection, new trade opportunities, stable food supplies, and a powerful cultural identity. Festivals, temples, public works, and shared myths strengthened a sense of unity. Citizens felt part of something grand, something enduring. The state wasn't just a political system, it was a story people lived inside. But the rise of states also brought social hierarchy to a completely new level. Classes began to solidify. Elites controlled the land, the wealth, and the resources. Priests gained immense spiritual authority. Scribes became the gatekeepers of knowledge. Soldiers enforced the decisions made at the top, and common farmers supported the entire structure with their labor. It certainly wasn't a fair system, but it worked. For most people, the benefits of order, predictability, and safety were worth the price. Still, the most important part of early states wasn't the buildings or the armies, it was legitimacy. A state could only survive if the people believed the system was right. So, rulers developed deeper myths, stronger rituals, and grander symbols to reinforce their power. Crowns, staffs, thrones, massive temples, each represented the ruler's divine or political authority. Art and writing glorified leaders, connecting them to gods, ancestors, or the cosmic order. The state didn't just organize society, it justified it. And as these states strengthened, something remarkable happened. They began interacting with each other. Trade routes stretched across entire regions. Knowledge spread. Technologies traveled from one civilization to another. Metalworking, the wheel, writing systems, agricultural techniques, and religious ideas. States competed. They learned from each other, and they grew together. This competition pushed human organization even further. Some states became powerful kingdoms. Some kingdoms grew into vast empires, and some rulers gained so much power that they reshaped the entire region around them. But none of this would have been possible without the foundation that states created, a foundation built on law, structure, social classes, and belief. The rise of states marked a true turning point in human history. People were no longer simply members of tribes or villages. They were now citizens, subjects, or participants in vast, organized societies that could shape the world around them with enormous force. And yet, with this new level of organization came the next great challenge: managing labor, wealth, and power in ways that shaped daily life more deeply than ever before. This leads us to our next transformation: how early humans created the economic systems, labor divisions, and structured societies that fueled the growth of entire civilizations. The next topic is the power of economy. As states began to rise and societies grew more and more complex, a new force started shaping human life. The economy. This wasn't just about trade or buying and selling. It was a fully organized system of work, production, and exchange. It wasn't just a feature of civilization, it was the engine that powered it. Without a strong economic structure, early states would have collapsed under their own weight. But with it, they didn't just survive. They flourished. The very first economies were simple. People farmed, they hunted, they made basic tools for themselves. But once states appeared on the scene, everything changed. Populations exploded. Cities began demanding massive amounts of food, water, raw materials, and labor. Suddenly, every single person had a role to play, not just for their own survival, but for the survival of the state itself. The economy became a kind of living organism, and every individual was feeding energy into it. The first major transformation was the specialization of labor. Instead of everyone doing a little bit of everything, people started mastering single trades. Farmers grew food full-time. Potters dedicated their lives to creating pottery. Metalworkers forged tools and weapons day in and day out. Weavers made cloth. Builders constructed massive walls, temples, and irrigation systems. And scribes documented everything. This specialization made society incredibly efficient. It allowed people to become true experts in their fields. And once people became experts, productivity skyrocketed. A farmer who grows food every day can feed dozens of people. A metalworker who trains for years creates tools that can completely transform agriculture, warfare, and construction. A potter perfects storage jars that preserve grain for months. The economy was no longer just about survival, it was about innovation. But specialization brought something else. Something even more powerful: dependency. The farmer now depended on the potter for storage jars. The potter depended on the farmer for food, and both of them depended on the metalworker for their tools. This intricate web of interdependence made society stronger. It gave people reasons to cooperate beyond their immediate family or tribe. It created powerful social ties between total strangers. The next great leap forward was trade. People weren't just exchanging goods within their own village anymore. They started trading across entire regions. Cities began swapping grain for metals. Mountain communities traded stone for cloth. River civilizations traded fish for timber. Over time, these trade routes expanded across continents, carrying not only goods but also new ideas and technologies. Where rivers flowed, trade blossomed. And where trade blossomed, cities exploded with wealth. Economies truly became the engines of civilization. Yet, with all this newfound wealth came inequality. Not everyone benefited equally. Some families gained control over valuable farmland, workshops, or trade routes. Others became laborers, working simply for daily rations. Rulers taxed production, demanding a share of grain, livestock, or crafted goods. Temples collected offerings from the faithful. The elites began to accumulate vast resources. Over generations, these differences in wealth became locked into the very fabric of society. Still, even this inequality played a role in the growth of civilizations. The wealth concentrated at the top allowed states to fund massive projects, things like grand temples, huge storage facilities, palaces, canals, and city walls. These projects both protected and unified society. Without that economic surplus, none of this would have been possible. But the economy wasn't just physical, it had to be organized. States created complex systems to track all of their resources. Scribes would meticulously count grain harvests. Administrators recorded taxes. Granaries were built to store surplus food for lean times. Ration systems were developed to feed armies of workers. And markets were established to regulate exchange. This organization made the economy predictable and scalable. A bad harvest didn't automatically mean destruction anymore. The stored food saved lives. A large construction project did untapped to descend into chaos. Workers were paid with rations in an organized way. For the first time in history, humans built systems that could last far beyond a single generation. Perhaps the most remarkable invention tied to this economic growth was currency. Early forms weren't coins like we think of today. They were things like standardized weights of grain, metal, ingots, shells, or bolts of cloth. Currency allowed people to measure value consistently. It solved the difficult problem of unequal exchange. It turned trade into a powerful, flexible system. Once currency existed, wealth became measurable. Savings became possible. Debt became enforceable. Investment became a real concept. The economy evolved into a structured force, pushing civilizations ever forward. Yet, the greatest impact of the early economy wasn't material, it was social. The economy created social classes. At the very top were the rulers, priests, wealthy merchants, and landowners. Below them were the artisans, scribes, farmers, traders, and soldiers. And at the bottom were the laborers and enslaved or forced workers. This structure shaped every aspect of daily life: where people lived, what jobs they did, what their children inherited, and how society functioned as a whole. The economy wasn't just about wealth, it was about identity. And as states grew wealthier, something predictable happened next. Rulers used the economy to expand their power. They funded larger and more professional armies. They built stronger walls to defend their cities. They sponsored grand temples to legitimize their rule. They supported vast bureaucracies to manage their territory. They controlled valuable trade routes. They regulated markets to their advantage. Wealth became influence, and influence became authority. The economy didn't just support the statute, it enabled the birth of empires. But before these empires could truly rise, societies needed something else. They needed a way to coordinate massive labor forces, expand their infrastructure on an unprecedented scale, and unite large, diverse populations under a single, powerful identity. This next transformation would reshape entire continents. It was time for the world's first mass projects, megastructures, and enduring symbols of power. Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.